Welcome to Biblical Foundations, a podcast of the Center for Biblical Studies at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm your co-host, Jimmy Rowe, along with Dr. Andreas Kostenberger. Join us as we discuss issues in biblical scholarship for the church. We're with Don Carson today discussing issues related to biblical theology and biblical scholarship. Dr. Carson, if we can shift gears for a moment, while a New Testament scholar and biblical scholar, you've continually maintained a focus on church ministry, and you're also president of the Gospel Coalition. I actually remember first attending the first gathering of the Gospel Coalition on the Trinity campus, I believe in 2007.
That's right.
There were about 500 or 600 of us packed out in Trinity Chapel, eagerly waiting to hear this new initiative. Please tell us about how TGC started and how you've seen the work of TGC progress over the past 10 or 12 years.
Well, it began with a sidewalk cafe lunch that Tim Keller and I enjoyed in New York City in 2002. We had become friends at a distance without actually having met when we worked on our book on worship by the book. And I had admired his ministry from afar, and he knew about me. And then we both were invited to speak at EMA, Evangelical Ministers Assembly in London, about 2000 or 2001, thereabouts. And we hit it off. And it was the sort of instant friendship where you get together and talk and sort out the whole universe, and then look around for another universe. It was an instant friendship. In 2002, I was in Princeton doing something or other and took the fast train into New York City. And it turns out that we had both been interested in asking the question, is it worthwhile establishing an organization that's broadly reformed and that draws in people from different denominations, that becomes understood to be the kind of center of confessional evangelicalism in North America? And having explored that, eventually we called together, by invitation, 40 pastors. We wanted them to be pastors because the kinds of questions pastors ask are different from the kinds of questions that pure theologians ask. And we invited 40 people to come, and 40 people came. That was already well-nigh miraculous.
Right.
And it included some names that are well known today, like John Piper and Mark Dever and Lig Duncan and others, and some who are more obscure. We purposely tried to include some who were Hispanic or Asian or African American, so it wasn't going to be a white man's club. And there were a lot of suspicions at first. We spent about a third of our time listening to one another's stories, just praying for one another. And we got only far enough after 3 days to warrant trying to write up a statement of faith and theological vision of ministry. Well, that was debated over 3 years, and we held our first public conference, as you indicated, in 2007. And as you say, there were about 600 there. But what was striking is that 70% or 75% of those that were there were under the age of 40.
That's interesting.
And that sort of ratio has continued in all of our ministries since then, too. And in retrospect, I think it was largely because about the same time we decided that everything that we produced would be digital and free. That automatically gears toward the younger generation. Do you see?
Yeah.
By 2009, at our 2009 conference, there were 2,700 present. And in 2011, there were 7,000 present. And so it's gone. And eventually a women's conference was started, but it wasn't going to be a conference about women and women's issues. It was a conference about Bible teaching, God, and the gospel for women. And our next conference along those lines is this coming June 2020, where we fully expect 10,000 people. And that ministry has expanded to regional weekend training sessions for women on how to read and teach and interpret the Bible, not least in a complementarian setting, because we are a complementarian organization. We think that's important in our day and generation. And then because digital communication doesn't recognize international borders, pretty soon we were getting requests from other languages and other cultures, other countries, and so on to help them start something in Francophone Europe and in the Spanish-speaking world, and so on and so on. And so we early on adopted the policy that the aim in such expansion was to ensure that such developments were self-governing, self-financing, self-controlling. We didn't want this to be another instance of an American mission board in which we were controlling the whole world from Chicago or the like. And that's taken some work, but it's developing in all kinds of ways so that our language sites are now diverse. And in some parts of the world where we're blocked, nevertheless, people can get access to what we're doing by satellite downloads and VPNs and so on. Virtual private networks, as they're called. And so last year, we had 37 million different visitors to our sites.
Wow.
That's not 37 million visits, but 37 million different visitors, and growing something like 30 or 35% a year. So a great deal of credit and thanksgiving go to our editors and producers and writers and translators and so on. There's an awful lot of work that's done behind the scenes, trying to make sure that we're theologically robust. And now we're beginning to develop whole curricular materials for use on smartphones. We forget that smartphones were first invented in 2007. That's when they first appeared. But just as God prepared the way for the Reformation by the invention of the printing press 70 years earlier, so we cannot help but wonder what God is preparing the way for by the invention of the smartphone. And I recently came back from Africa. There are many, many villages you go to where a Westerner like myself wouldn't dare drink the water, but all the leaders have smartphones.
That's right.
And they're mostly 2G speed and so on, but that's adequate for text. And so there are developments that are happening around the world on curricular matters. 85% of the world's Christian pastors have no theological formation.
Wow.
85%. And by God's grace, we want to address that and close that gap as much as we can, and that will be done, as far as I can see, in the near future by the digital world rather than the print world. So, at our conferences, the average age is still very young, and that promises well for the future.
Yeah.
We have a pretty rigorous statement of faith that we adhere to robustly on our council, and theological vision of ministry, and it's been a rare joy and privilege to work with these folk.
It would probably be safe to say then, back in 2007, God has far exceeded any expectations you or Tim Keller might have had.
Oh yes, undoubtedly. I'd like to be able to sit here and tell you that we planned it all out, but we didn't. It grew so rapidly and so quickly that the most we were doing really was building the structure to support it and to nurture it and to make sure it didn't get out of hand and so on. We're organized enough now that we can plot ahead carefully, but many elements have just exploded around us, and we've scrambled to try to find the money to build the next stage and to make sure there's discipline and confessionalism that is not moving.
Yeah, perfect timing. Now,
let me add something to that. This is an age also of what Lig Duncan, one of our counselors, likes to call big God theology. And there is a rise of what he calls big God theology, not only in America, but in North America, South America, some parts of Europe, certainly parts of Africa, many parts of Asia. This is a movement that's really becoming quite significant with different shapes and different organizations and so on. But we're part of that, and as much the receivers of it as the purveyors of it. And this is a great time to be alive and to observe what God is doing in all kinds of humbling and powerful ways.
Yeah, somebody who attended that early 2007 gathering, I remember listening to their talks and sensing that there was a sense of movement happening.
Yes.
Even though all the structures weren't in place, the organization obviously wasn't in place, that wasn't the sense that I got listening to the vision and the impetus behind TGC.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Whereas some evangelicals are glass half empty people and observe the social statistics and become discouraged. Yet, at the same time, God is raising up a new generation of church planters. The last generation I've had of seminary students are amongst the best as far as I'm concerned, because they're more than with Calebite spirits saying, give me this mountain, wanting to go to the Muslim countries or wanting to plant multiracial churches in big cities. Or they're wanting hard assignments and they want to be mentored. They're not arrogant. They want to learn. And or whole organizations like Acts 29 have sprung up, part of this big God Theology movement, and in Britain the Gospel Partnerships and other things elsewhere, and one can be profoundly grateful for these things and wonder how great a privilege it is to be part of it, not because we're bringing it about, but because in God's mercy we're enabled to participate in it.
Dr. Carson, while there will likely always be disagreements on the finer points of theology, such as the mode of baptism or the precise scenario unfolding surrounding the return of Christ, as biblical Christians, we can find unity in the gospel message. But that said, I'd like to ask you, do you find the language of gospel-centeredness helpful in every respect, or would you register any caveats there? For example, the role of men and women in the church is not a gospel truth required for conversion, but you can't get very far in the Christian life without asking what the Bible teaches about how we ought to live out our male or female identity. So I wonder, is gospel centrality sufficiently comprehensive to cover all aspects of the Christian life, or is a term sometimes used too narrowly, or am I perhaps misunderstanding what is meant by gospel-centered?
Well, it's difficult to find one expression that is going to resolve all points of conflict. That's a mistake. So I think that gospel-centeredness is a useful category, but it's not useful for everything. In terms of the kinds of things you're talking about, there's a book that is coming out, God willing, next March-ish or something like that, by Gavin Ortland. I've forgotten the exact title, but it's really about theological triage. In medical triage, you come to a disaster and there are bodies everywhere, and some are bleeding out and some have broken arms and so on. And the medical people have to make decisions about what people are going to help first. If they don't have the resources to help everybody right away, who gets fixed first, as it were. And Christians have long recognized, though the expression gospel triage is relatively recent. I think it was Al Mohler that coined it. Yet, another way of referring to the same thing is hierarchialization of truths. That is, some things you die for. Some things are really important and are important to the organization and structure of a local church. And some things are important for other kinds of purposes. He has himself 4 categories, and some things you can just say, get over it, don't worry about it. And after all, there is such triage, such hierarchicalization, even within the New Testament, so that writing to the Galatians, Paul says, if anyone preach any other gospel other than the one that we have preached to you, let him be anathema. And in other words, a gospel issue in that domain that he has in mind, you're either right or you're wrong, and you need to be right to escape the apostolic anathema. On the other hand, he can write of some people in Philippians chapter 1. Some people have bad motives when they're preaching, but at least they're preaching Christ. I can put up with that. Elsewhere in Pauline correspondence, if you're, for example, Romans 14, on certain issues regarding days and so on, let each be fully persuaded in his own mind, but don't split the church over it. So Paul himself can make distinctions between the relatively weighted importance of this or that, and we need to do the same thing today, so that you get some people who are angry all the time and everything is confrontation and so on, and other people who are so careless that the truth is easily lost just because, in the name of forgiveness and forbearance and love, they let rank heresy enter the camp. So it's always a question. It has been a question from the first decades of the Christian church to do some of the importance of doing theological triage. And I think the little book that's coming out by Gavin Ortland in a few months will be of considerable help in that regard.
I look forward to that. I've seen sometimes such an emphasis placed on, say, the Great Commission that you wonder if those people have any room for, say, Christians in the arts or, so I guess C.S. Lewis once wrote, I think, we murder to dissect. In other words, you alluded to the beginning of your answer, the limitation of labels that can only do so much. So I feel like sometimes maybe we're drawing the lines a little too sharply. And as a result, we maybe minimize that certain things are maybe supremely important, but then nothing else matters. That would be an extreme. And so my concern is that we have enough texture and gradation that maybe the role of men and women is maybe not as important as that 1 Corinthians 15:3 and 4, that Christ died and was buried and rose according to the scriptures, but it is still an essential part of our human existence on this earth. And so I sometimes wish there were sufficient texture, and I find the way some people use gospel-centeredness makes me wonder if they adequately have room in the labels they use for the kind of a full-orbed vision of the Christian life.
Those are things that Gavin tries to talk about in his book. I've read the manuscript, and I think that he'll be helpful. It's one of those areas, again, where if you talk in the abstract, people can all agree or disagree. It's how the rubber hits the road, how you make change out of it, that determines whether people agree or not. So it takes more than can be resolved in a podcast.
I think one of the most encouraging developments is TGC's global impact. And I know a large part of your ministry is overseas. I believe you were in Malaysia and other places recently. Perhaps you can share some of the needs that you feel that TGC is able to meet, or some of the needs that we need to be aware of in your travels overseas.
Yes, a part of the needs are bound up with what I've already mentioned. That is that there are a lot of pastors, even with little access to theological formation. Either books are too expensive, or they're in part of the world where there's suppression or too much poverty even to buy books, and so on, or linguistic barriers. There is a TGC in Africa now. It'll become regionalized, I'm sure, in due course, but it's continent-wide at the moment. And one of its obvious successes is that its council is drawn from about 8 or 12 countries. But if these guys wrote something in their home patch, it would be read by a few people in their local church and so on. They write for the TGC Africa site, and suddenly they've got continental reach. And that encourages people to write more and more thoughtfully and read more deeply and so on. So it becomes not only a way of ministering to others, but of strengthening themselves. That's really quite important. And the Francophone world, in Europe at least, it's a bit different in French Canada, but in Francophone Europe, that's not only France and Brussels, but reaching also to French West Africa. And the resources that are biblical, theological, and rich and so on are relatively slim, but the organization there is called Évangile 21, Gospel 21, and it's had a conference every 2 years now for, I think, 4 cycles, 8 years, and it's just under 1,000 people that gather, and once again, 70%, 75% are under the age of 40 or 45. And there's a rising interest in expository preaching. It's a day of small things. It's not as if revival has broken out, but there is something going on there that was not there 10 years ago. And so although in many corners of the world it's a day of small things, it's nevertheless encouraging. And in the Spanish-speaking world, TGC is taking off like wildfire. I think in part because a lot of the Spanish-speaking world, and in fact the Latin world, which includes Portuguese, of course, in Brazil, there has been such a sweeping influence from the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel folk. But they're now in their third generation, and their children's children are becoming suspicious. They see that it doesn't work, and there's a certain amount of deceit bound up with the whole thing. And they watch what we're doing on our sites or even on television. They watch people like Miguel Nunez preach and Suel Michelin and people like that. And they come to us and they don't say, "Oh, we like your theology, please teach us." They come to us and say, "How do you teach the Bible like that? Show us how to teach the Bible." And the result is that there's quite a compelling a turn from some churches and other traditions to a more reformed, big God theology that is interested in getting the Bible right, of understanding it, teaching it in its own terms without simple proof texting and so on. And I could tell you many stories of turnarounds and reaching out into places that have just known nothing of this 15 years ago. As one of our colleagues says, when the Reformation came through 500 years ago, it didn't even touch Latin America. It will not pass us by this time. And that's pretty encouraging too. Where all this will end up, I don't know, but it's sure a great time to be alive and watch leaders organizing like Jairo Namnun, for example, who's in the DR and is one of our staff people overseeing international things. And he's a very capable young man with a rare discernment for someone as young as he is. So this is a great time to be alive and watch what God is doing and raising up.
That's quite remarkable. It almost sounds like the same thing we saw in North America, where TGC kind of provided structure and organization.
Yes, that's right.
We see that being multiplied.
That's right. And now there's one that started in Korea, of course, South Korea, that's barely a year old. And there are meetings that are exploring the possibility of similar things elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So there are parts of the world where we won't operate because it would just draw attention to Christians in forbidden minorities and so on. So we want to be careful. We're not trying to make things difficult for people, but to provide the resources that people need is really, really important.
Thank you for joining us today at Biblical Foundations. For more information, please visit the Center for Biblical Studies at Midwestern at cbs.mbts.edu. For further resources, please also visit biblicalfoundations.org. Please join us again next time at the Biblical Foundations podcast.